There are many things that can sway someone's opinion on a game. A deal breaker for one might be what makes the game for another. For me, whether or not I enjoy a game really boils down to five main sections: characters, story, exploration, combat, and music. Not necessarily in that order. Without further ado, let's get into my thoughts on Dark Cloud. Dark Cloud on the PlayStation 2 was one of those games that I restarted over and over and over again as a kid because I had the crippling inability to finish games before the age of 14, but I also just really loved Dark Cloud. I loved everything about it. Going back to it now as an adult and actually finishing it, I have to say that love was not unjustified. Dark Cloud is a really, really good game, and it holds up surprisingly well despite being 23 years old. Our story starts right off with some shenanigans going on in the form of an ancient ritual being overseen by some weird German-looking guy who I thought was going to have more plot relevance, and his associate who had about as much plot relevance as I expected. It turns out the ritual in question is their attempt to revive an ancient demon known as the Dark Genie. Why, you ask? Because the German-looking dude wanted to rule the world, of course, and what better way to do that than to free an ancient primordial being known to destroy the world, and hope that he's grateful enough that he'll bend to your will. Cut to our main character Toan, who is trying to enjoy the lovely festival his village put on, and the Dark Genie decided to go along with the destroy the world plot after all, and subsequently destroys the world. Toan wakes up in an empty field that used to be his town and meets the fairy king Simba. Simba tells us all about how we are the hero of the Atlamilia, which is a lovely green rock that gives us the power to unseal Atla. And we learn that the whole town and world actually wasn't completely destroyed, and instead each piece was put into an Atla bubble and scattered across the Divine Beast Cave. So it is now our mission to collect all these pieces and rebuild our town. I want to just interject a quick little note here. A really, really plot-relevant character gets introduced at the beginning of the game and reappears in Divine Beast Cave, but then he does not come back until he's plot-relevant again at like the very end of the game. He's also my favorite character, and I think he was one of my first crushes as a kid because I was like unnaturally excited to see him again. I was so hyped. Anyways, moving right back along, we don't stop with our town. We need to actually deal with the Dark Genie himself, and in order to reseal him and get rid of him and put him away, we need the assistance of the Moon People who sealed him away the last time. Meaning we go on a really awesome journey to get to the moon. After 4 dungeons, we finally do get to the moon, and we learn that they don't know how to seal the genie away after all. So we go the brute force route. We eventually make it to Dark Heaven Castle, and we learn of where the Dark Genie actually came from, and that the only way to stop him is to travel back in time to the incident that created him and destroy him then. And after we do that, everything's back to being hunky-dory. So there you go. That's my very vague plot synopsis, so we can all dive into the characters with a little context, but not so much that I'm repeating myself. My favorite part of Dark Cloud is the characters, and not just the playable characters, but also the NPCs residing in the towns we rebuilt. While you don't necessarily need to rebuild each town, and you definitely don't need to 100% them, I think it's really vital to your overall enjoyment of the game if you do so. A lot of the character details come from little cutscenes we get from the townspeople, and it's just really satisfying to get the rewards for 100%ing each town. For example, in Muskalaka/Raka, because it's kind of different and I'm not really sure which one's the official because L and R in Japanese is like the same, we learn that Toan's father once came there and was also a warrior like Toan was. In fact, a lot of people in the town recognize him because of their eyes being similar. Not to mention, there are quite a few scenes that are just really goofy and silly to watch, like the fortune teller in Queens, or like Ruby heckling the weapons merchant to get free stuff. It's just those little flavor scenes that kind of add more enjoyment to the world and add a little bit more flavor to the characters. And they're just so fun. They're just so silly. In terms of our actual player characters themselves, each one has a unique skill set, so which one you enjoy more in terms of like combat is largely up to your own personal playstyle and how lucky you are with the weapons draws in the dungeon. Because outside of Toan, who gets really good weapons just from rebuilding towns and such, everyone else is kind of at the mercy of RNG for the most part. Toan is the main character and he's able to unseal the Atla, so he is on the field a lot. Also, in general, he's just really strong. I think I would argue that he's the strongest unit in the game. I think a large reason for that is characters you get earlier in the game, like Toan, have a lot more time to build up their weapons and a lot more time for you to get lucky with the chest to get more weapons. And just in general, like, when you're pulling weapons for Osmond, you have a 1 in 6 chance of it being a weapon for him, but when you have just Toan, it's always going to be a weapon for Toan, so there's a very high chance of you getting a good one early on. By the time I made it to the Shipwreck dungeon, Toan's endurance and speed on his sword were both maxed out. Not to mention, Toan's charged attack gives him a very, very healthy sum of iframes, so he's no joke on the field. Like, I think he was probably my most used character. Xiao is the cat that was transformed by the change potion. She is a ranged attacker and can jump over large gaps. For me, Xiao was my most used ranged attacker. I managed to snag a couple really good weapons for her early on, and I never got anything decent for Ruby or Osmond, so she just became my choice of attacker. Xiao also has the fastest move speed on the field, so if you're fresh out of Dran's Feathers and need to get from A to B faster, then Xiao's your girl. Goro is a hunter of Matataki village and the son of Fudo, the greatest warrior. After his father's death, Goro shuts himself off from the rest of the village, blaming them for what happened. It's only after we return the hunter's necklace and the memories of his father that Goro realizes the truth of what happened behind his father's death. Goro decides to come with us in order to prove himself, but insists that he's not doing it for anyone but himself. I really like Goro as a character. I think he's really funny and I like his little sound effects. He's like wah wah when he attacks. However, I'm not a fan of heavy weapon wielding characters because they're slower. They're just much slower. Not to mention, any physical character in this game is automatically competing with Toan, and Toan is just so strong that there's very few scenarios where Goro would be the better choice over Toan or Xiao. Ruby is the Genie of Queens, and she has one of the funniest character intros out of all of them. Not to mention, she is really, really pretty. Ruby kind of suffers the same fate as Goro, where she's essentially a slower version of Xiao. I never ended up getting a decent weapon for Ruby, so her damage output, especially in the Gallery of Time, was not fantastic. I will say though, the hitboxes on Mimics were really, really janky, so Ruby was my character of choice to deal with them. But outside of that, I very rarely used Ruby. Ungaga is a warrior of the desert, and he kind of reminds me of Nuvolets from Genshin Impact, like when he uses his normal attack, because Ungaga will straight up be like, and then like when he gets attacked, he'll be like, and that's pretty funny. I don't use Ungaga. Like, I think outside of the mandatory floors, that's like the only time I ever used him, and I dread those floors because while he has really good reach with his weapon and his move speed is better than Goro's, his damage output with his first weapon is atrocious. Like, once I got the Mirage from completing Muskalaka, he was like a little better, but he runs into the same issue as Goro does, where Toan is just all around a stronger character to use. I will say though, his charge attack is really fun, but it comes with the caveat that the animation to dispel the black winds takes forever. Osmond is an inventor on the moon. He's a bunny character. His magnum opus is the Sun Giant, which is like a giant robot we use to attack the Dark Genie initially. Osmond uses guns, and he's a little eccentric in a very silly way. I really liked Osmond as a character. I really liked watching his interactions with Toan, because like the way he kept like slapping Toan's hand aside was like pretty funny. However, as a unit, I ran into the same problems as I did with Ungaga, with the fact that he is a very late character. I struggled a little bit with him. I think objectively, Osmond is a better unit than Xiao or Ruby. He can move while he fires and has a faster fire speed. Not to mention, he can fly over gaps, which I don't have to watch Zhao's jump animation for, so that's pretty nice. However, like Ungaga, his first weapon is really bad, so much so that in the Moon Crater, I had to leave the dungeon on the Osmond only floor because it was taking 5 minutes and 4 repair powders to get through one enemy. You can get some decent beginner weapons for him, either at the store in Yellow Drops or through the fishing minigame if you're patient enough. But while they're good enough to get you through the mandatory floors, they're not fantastic. I actually don't know about the fishing weapon because I didn't have the patience to get it. I got to like 200 points and then I was like, I'm bored, I'm gonna go do something else. And finally, that brings me to Seda. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, that's how I'm going to be saying it. Seda is first introduced at the very, very beginning of the game. And by introduced, I mean we see him sneaking around the Genie Castle, leading me to believe that he is a good guy. Also, I thought he was a genie because of his resemblance to Ruby and his red gem, so I was calling him Hot Genie Guy and subsequently labeled all files that had him in it Hot Genie Guy as well. Haha. We see Seda again in Naroon Village, and we get a really cool duel scene with him that I did not record because I suck. But this time around he has red eyes and he seems a little evil. That duel results in him giving us the change potion, bidding us his farewell, saying that we'll see him again, and then we don't see him again until the very end of the game. We see a little cutscene with him once we get to Darkhaven Castle where he's talking with the Fairy King, and this is when we learn that Hot Genie Guy is actually the King of the East from 400 years ago who made a deal with a witch in order to help him save his country at war. By doing so, he invites the black blood inside him and essentially creates the Dark Genie. We see one more scene with him where he explains all of that to Toan and then he sacrifices himself in order to open a way to the Gallery of Time so that Toan and company can travel back 400 years and stop the incident that created the Dark Genie from happening. The Gallery of Time is like a really cool dungeon for me because rather than gathering the normal like town pieces from Atla to like rebuild the towns, we actually get fragments of Seda's memories throughout the Gallery of Time, and by the end of it we learn the full story of Seda and how he came to create the Dark Genie. We have this joke in my house called Adrian's Curse because in, I would say, about 85% of the media I consume, my favorite character either dies or gets severely injured or ends up in the hospital where somebody tells them they're gonna die. So when I came up the stairs to tell my mom about the unfortunate fate befalling my beloved Hot Genie Guy, she just laughed. And like, I'm out here going through it and everybody's just laughing. You get the idea. I've talked a little bit about the town building, but I wanted to talk a bit about the actual combat as well. Dark Cloud is what you would call a get good game. While there are items you can get to upgrade your character's defense, HP level, and water level, not to mention the actual weapon upgrading system, there is no traditional way to make your character stronger. You can't just kill enemies and then become stronger through XP. Like, once you've exhausted the items that are available to you at any given point in the game, that's kind of the level where you're at. So you just gotta learn the enemy patterns and stuff. If you're somebody who's kind of watched my videos in the past, you might know that I don't generally play games like that. But I had a lot of fun with sucking at the game and then having the satisfaction of not sucking anymore. So yeah, there's some fun in it. As I mentioned earlier, you spend a lot of time in Dark Cloud rebuilding the towns, and a lot of the side content stems from that. However, there's also the fishing minigame, which is okay, unless you're trying to grind it, then it's a little annoying. There's an item exchange questline type thing, and then there's also the back rooms in the main dungeons. Essentially, you can get like an item that lets you go to a bonus area where the monsters are stronger, but there's a bunch of extra treasure chests and you can get cool items and stuff like that to make your character stronger. Outside of that, there isn't an immense amount of extra stuff in Dark Cloud. However, once you beat the game, you get access to an extra dungeon called the Demon Shaft, which is 100 floors and has a cool boss at the end of it, allegedly. I only did the first floor because, I'm gonna be honest, without the incentive of Atla, I don't really like the dungeon crawling. I find it a little repetitive. Not to mention, on the first floor of the Demon Shaft, my Toan could handle it, but his damage output was not fantastic, and I was kind of like, no, this is gonna be really hard if I try to do this. So I was like, nah, I don't want to do it right now. Maybe later. And that brings me to the music. Dark Cloud has a criminally good soundtrack. Like, if I'm being honest, it was unexpectedly good. I remember the music being good from when I was a kid, but it blew me away as an adult. I don't think there's a single bad track in the entire game, and outside of maybe like the Divine Beast Cave theme, every song hits really, really hard. My personal favorites are the opening song and the Wise Owl Forest theme. Random thoughts I had while playing the game. Ba-da-da-da-da-da. I had this theory that all genies are just like criminally attractive because of Hot Genie Guy and Ruby. And then my brother was all like, what about the Dark Genie? Do you think he's hot? So the theory was a bust. But then we found out that the Dark Genie was actually a demon and not a genie. So my theory was back to holding water. But then we found out that Ruby was the only actual genie in the game, and therefore there was not enough data to support my theory. I really like that you have a water bar and that your weapons can break. I can see why both mechanics might be annoying, and I certainly have been annoyed with them at times, but I also think it's really cool and adds a fun immersive factor. In general, I don't think the game was super difficult. In my opinion, I think Wise Owl Forest and the shipwreck were the hardest points in the game, and then it got really easy for Sun and Moon Temple and the Moon Crater dungeons, and then it picked back up with the Gallery of Time. Building on the last point, none of the bosses were very hard except for Lysia. Some of the hitboxes for her were just complete bullshit, and her homing missile move was like, honestly, I did 3 laps of the dungeon and it was still following me. My brother, who is like the king of Get Good games, watched me play this boss, and he also said like the hitboxes were kind of janky and kind of bullshit. Unfortunately, I wasn't recording when I had when all of the bullshit was happening, and then when I hooked my computer up to all of my recording equipment to record off my PlayStation 2, I beat her on my first try. So I didn't get any recordings of her janky moveset. I'm not sure whether or not that's a win or a loss, because on one hand, I beat her, but on the other hand, I really wanted to show you guys what bullshit it was. Ungaga gets his nipple sucked, and it's pretty funny. Did I mention that Sada's my favorite character enough throughout this video? He's my favorite character, just so everyone's clear on that point. In conclusion, Dark Cloud will always have a special place in my heart from my childhood, but it turns out I'm not just blinded by nostalgia. The game's story, while fairly straightforward, is supplemented with its silly moments, fun gameplay, cool character mechanics, and an amazing soundtrack. If you haven't already, go play Dark Cloud.